In our narration, we have that Salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad eats away at sins the same way fire eats away at dry wood. Salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق والمرسلين وخاتم النبيين حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا سيدنا ومولانا أبا القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا بالملكة الكبرى السيدة الشهيدة العالمة العارفة سيدتنا ومولاتنا فاطمة بنت محمد صلوات الله عليها وعلى أبيها وبعلها وبنيها واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين منذ آدم إلى قيام يوم الدين. I send my condolences to the entire Islamic Ummah, to Imam al-Zaman, Ajal Allah Ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif, to our Marajia, to the blessed heart of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. On the tragic occasion of the martyrdom of Fatimah alayhi salam, this tragedy, which according to our Imams alayhi salam, they say the tragedy of Az-Zahra salamullahi alayha broke the heart of every one of our Imams, and there is not an Imam from the beginning of Adam up until the time of Imam Zaman alayhi salam that does not weep for Fatimah. For if there is no day like the day of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, as our Imam say, La yawmuka yawmuka ya Abu Abdullah, then it is in fact, and hold on to this belief, and believe me when I say that no Arab would have pierced a chest in Karbala had the nails not pierced the ribs of Sayyidina Zahra alayhi salam. No ribs would have been trampled under the hooves of the horses in Karbala had the ribs of Fatimah alayhi salam not been shattered behind that door. No tent in Karbala would have been burned if the door of Fatimah alayhi salam had not been burned. By Allah, on the day the house of Fatimah alayhi salam was attacked, those who attacked that house on that day, had they been able to burn the arsh, the throne of Allah Azza wa Jal, they would have. If they could have broken the ribs of Allah Himself, they would have. If they could have slapped the face of Allah Azza wa Jal Himself, they would have, and they in fact did slap the face of Allah Azza wa Jal Himself. As our Imams alayhi salam say, we are the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So understand the magnitude of this tragedy. Understand the magnitude that it is not just a tragedy of a woman who was beloved to our Prophet, that she was simply the daughter of our Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, and something tragic happened to her. Do not belittle this tragedy. Do not let it go by year and year and not commemorate it. I just wanted to emphasize on the magnitude of the tragedy before we got into the cause of the tragedy. Inshallah, the topic we'll be discussing today is Fatimah alayhi salam, the first mother of wilayah. What led Sayyidina Zahra alayhi salam to her death? What is it that brought the army of Iblis to the door which angels used to wait at every single day? What brought the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enter a home that Jibreel would ask for permission to enter, yet the army of Iblis would enter this home without permission? In fact, they would enter the home after Fatimah alayhi salam had commanded them to stay away from the house. And may the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon him who was informed that in the house is Fatimah alayhi salam وَقَالَ وَإِنْ. And he said, وَإِنْ. And so what? With the salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, inshallah, we'll begin. قال تعالى في محكم التنزيل بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقال لهم نبيهم إن الله قد بعث لكم طالوت ملكا قالوا أنى يكون له الملك علينا ونحن أحق بالملك منه ولم يؤت سعة من المال قال إن الله اصطفاه عليكم وزاده بسطة في العلم والجسم والله يؤتي ملكه من يشاء والله واسع عليم صدق الله العلي العظيم. And their prophet said to them, surely Allah has raised Talut to be a king over you. They said, how can he hold kingship over us while we have a greater right to kingship than he? And he has not been granted an abundance of wealth. He said, surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen him in preference to you, and he has increased him abundantly in knowledge and physique, and Allah grants his kingdom to whom he pleases, and Allah is ample giving, all knowing. Sadaqallahu al-Ali al-Azim. This verse, according to our hadith, is in reference to the story of the Prophet of Allah, Samuel alayhi salam. Samuel was a prophet of Bani Israel, and as he neared his death, his people asked him, appoint for us a king, appoint for us a wasi, somebody to lead us after you. After Samuel alayhi salam, after he pleads with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and after he prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal appoints a man named Talut. He says to Samuel, after you, Talut is your decision. Your wilayah is passed on to Talut. As we understand from the verse, Talut was of low social status amongst Bani Israel. So when Samuel alayhi salam, when he informs Bani Israel that Talut is to be the wali, he is my wasi after me, Bani Israel refused. They said to him, Talut is a poor man, he's of low social status, he doesn't have much wealth. Samuel alayhi salam reaffirms to them that Allah Azza wa Jal has gifted him with knowledge. He emphasizes that the wealth of a man is in his knowledge, and that Allah Azza wa Jal has preferred him over you. This is the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Follow Samuel. Follow Talut. After Talut is given lordship over Bani Israel, he's given wilayah over Bani Israel, he takes them into battle against the army of Goliath. Those of you who are familiar with the biblical story of David and Goliath, we won't go too deep into it. But only a small amount of believers followed Talut. And an even smaller amount continue with Talut. The army of Talut is tested at the river. In the continuation of the verse we see, Talut alayhi salam, he says to his soldiers, they get to a river before they get to the battle, and he says to them, he says, whoever drinks of this river is not from me. He must leave my army. Except he who takes one handful, only one handful of water. Anyone who drinks more than this is not from my army. This is Talut alayhi salam testing the loyalty of his companions, of his soldiers. The majority of Talut's army refused. They failed this test. The majority of Talut's army abandoned his wilayah for something so simple and so measly as an extra drink of water. They abandoned Talut alayhi salam. Why am I bringing this example? I bring this example because in the Islamic world today, as our ulama say, no sword has been unsheathed and no blood has been spilled within Islam more than has been spilled regarding wilayah and regarding iman. It is the most controversial difference that we have in Islam. And I'm not here tonight, inshallah, to go into a debate. I'm not here to go into a Shia, Sunni, Aqa'id or Imam. I will briefly touch on it just so we understand as Shia how we differ from the rest of the Muslim world and what our proofs are. And I ask, inshallah, with a sincere open heart, I ask all of you, those who have friends who do not belong to this school of thought, those who have friends who do not adhere to the madhab of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, it is your duty. You owe it to the ribs of Fatimah alayhi salam to put the cause of Fatimah in front of those who do not know Fatimah alayhi salam. This is a tax you have to pay for the blessing of the wilayah of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. So we see from most of the Muslim world, the argument is, this is the argument. The argument is, if Allah Azza wa Jal really wanted Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam as his Khalif, how is it possible that the majority of companions and the majority of those living at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, how is it that most of them defied this order, most of them failed this test? It makes no sense. The majority of the companions hear from Rasulullah hadith ghadir, and then the majority of them go and give their wilayah to other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. Those who are familiar with Quran and familiar with the stories of the Anbiya alayhi salam, they see that this is the sunnah of the nations. This is a history of the nations. We see that almost every single nation after its prophet was tested with Imam. And this was the test that they failed. Even though they lived a pious life with their prophet, whoever their prophet may be, when it came to the wasi, when it came to the visurgence of that prophet, the majority of them failed. We see, for example, after the death of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, the children of his son Ishaq alayhi salam, we read in the Quran, they ended up killing most of the prophets. They ended up killing most of the prophets. 124,000 prophets we have, according to our narration, more than half of them were killed by Bani Israel. Slaughtered. We see during the life of Nabi Musa alayhi salam, Bani Israel during Nabi Musa alayhi salam did not even wait for Musa to die. Musa was alive and well amongst them, and his visurgent was Harun alayhi salam. And during the life of Musa, they abandoned Harun. We know in the Quran, Musa alayhi salam, he goes to speak with Allah Azza wa Jalla. They say for 40 days. He goes to speak with Allah. In this time, we have As-Samiri, a companion of Musa, a loyal companion who's of stature, who was a scholar, who had influence, builds a calf out of gold, and tells the people, this is the God of Harun and Musa, and Harun is amongst them. And he leads the people astray. For this reason, we see Sayyidah Zahra alayhi salam, when she compares or when she wishes to speak of those who usurp the Khilafah from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, she refers to him as As-Samiri. As-Samiri wa Ajdan. Samiri and his calf. She draws this comparison. And after the death of Musa and Harun alayhi salam, after the death was Joshua, Yusha bin Nun. Yusha bin Nun was the visurgent of Musa sallallahu alayhi. And Bani Israel again refused to join his army, and they refused his imam. Sulaiman alayhi salam appoints Asif bin Barakhir as his wasi through the command of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Again, Bani Israel refused. After the death of Sulaiman, they abandoned Asif. Isa alayhi salam the Quran, in Surah Maryam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says regarding, He says, إِذْ قَالَ عِيسَى لِلْحَوَارِيُّونَ مَنْ أَنصَارِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. Isa alayhi salam, he says to his disciples, who are my victors to Allah? Who are my supporters towards Allah? فَقَالُوا الْحَوَارِيُّونَ نَحْنُ أَنصَارُ اللَّهِ. The disciples said, we are the friends of Allah, we are the supporters of Allah. What's the Quran say after that? فَآمَنَ طَائِفَةٌ مِّن بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ وَكَفَرَ الطَّائِفَةُ. A group amongst Bani Israel became believers in the disciples and held firmly onto the wilayah of the disciples, but the majority of them didn't. The majority of them waited. Isa alayhi salam appointed Simon as his wali and his wasi. He was abandoned even though he was a companion of Isa. But 30 years later, a non-believer, a kafir, a polytheist, a Roman named Paul, who never met Jesus, who never met the disciples, sees Jesus and the cross in the sky, and people believe him. And the Roman Empire takes the form of Catholicism and becomes the kingdom of Catholicism. More than this, we see that the initial sin, or the first, how can we say, the very first arrogance in the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is regarding Imam. When Allah Azza wa Jalla commands the angels to bow to Adam alayhi salam, the animosity towards Allah Azza wa Jalla begins in the heart of Iblis. Allah selects Adam as his Khalif, as his Imam, as his representative. Iblis refuses this. He doesn't refuse the worship of Allah Azza wa Jalla. And I've mentioned this before. He gives Allah Azza wa Jalla an alternative. He says, I still want to worship you. I love you. I want to worship you in my own way. For this reason, we have a narration by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. I think I've mentioned, but for its blessing, inshallah, the salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, I'll mention it again. Regarding Iblis, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, if Iblis were to fast all of the days and stand in prayer all of the nights, repenting and praying and praising Allah up until the day of judgment, Allah Azza wa Jalla will not accept from him a single deed until he goes to the grave of Adam and prostrates. The Imam continues, وَهَكَذَا هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ. And this also applies to this ummah. Were they to stand all the nights in prayer? Were they to spend all the days in fasting? Allah Azza wa Jalla will not accept from them a deed until they accept the wilayah of Muhammad wa ala Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So we've established now that to have this abandonment of the wasi is not something strange to the history of mankind. It's not something strange to the Quran. We mentioned the prophets that passed had the same problem. We mentioned that this problem was rampant amongst Bani Israel. And we know as Shia that this problem existed after the death of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Like I said, I'm not going to touch or dwell very much on the differences here because that's not what I'm here for. We'll leave this for another topic, inshallah. But very briefly, what is the difference between the Shia and our Sunni brothers regarding Imam? How did we differ so much? Very simple. According to our Sunni brothers, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi left no instruction after his death, left no instruction before his death regarding who his vicegerent is to be. He let it be. In Sunni theology, there are 5 ways for establishing who the Khalif is. 5 different methods. The first method is by shura. A council of elders selects, and this is how the first Khalif was elected. The second method is by appointment. One Khalif appoints the other, and this is how the second Khalif was appointed. The third method is by closed council. 4 or 5 individuals select one amongst them. This is how the third Khalif was elected. The fourth way is how Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, according to the Amma, according to the Sunnis, was elected, and it is by demand of the masses. The Muslims came to the door of Imam Ali alayhi salam after decades, begging him to take the Khilafah. The fifth way is the most interesting, and it's the way that we suffer from until today. It is the way that Muawiyah, la'natullahi alayhi, and the rest of Bani Umayyah, and the rest of Bani Abbas, all the way up until the Ottoman Empire, up until ISIS, which we have today, they depended on the fifth way, which is through violence, bloodshed, military takeovers, through the sword. This is how they established their Khilafah. There was a period where Bani Umayyah were killing one another. An uncle would kill a nephew would kill his uncle, brothers would kill one another. Until Bani Abbas came along, Bani Abbas and Bani Umayyah fought one another for the Khilafah. These are the 5 methods. According to the school of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, Imamah is established in only one way. We have no other method. One way. And it is that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu appoints His representative Himself. Allah Himself appoints His representative. Now this, we have several hadith, and I don't want to go into hadith al-Ghadir, and I don't want to get into hadith al-Thaqalain, and I don't want to get into the several proofs we have. Those who wish to delve into it, there are several books, great books you can read. You can read Al-Muraja'at, fantastic book that touches on this, goes really deep into this. You can read Peshawar Nights. Then I was guided. Several books have been written on this topic. But just for argument's sake here, we come from 2 sources for our argument. We as Shia have 2 sources. We have our intellect and we have scripture. We have aql and naql. Aql being our intellect and naql being scripture, which is Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad. So from an intellectual perspective, using our logic, very simply our logic and nothing else, when I come and I hear that the final messenger of Allah, and there is no messenger after him, and he is to summarize the message of 124,000 prophets, gives us laws regarding the simplest things: how to enter the bathroom, how to eat, how to wash our hands, how to run a nation, but leaves this dunya and gives us no advice on how to select a leader after him. Logically, this is unacceptable. Logically, such a prophet is incompetent to even run a convenience store, a supermarket. He can't run. He cannot run a house, his own family he cannot run. This is from simply a logical perspective. When we come to the Quran, several verses where Allah Azza wa Jal, we interpret that Allah Azza wa Jal directly ties Imam and Khilafah to himself. It's so simple. You and I differ on a topic, we agree on the Holy Quran. Bring the Holy Quran. Let's look at this topic. What does Allah say in the Quran regarding this topic? Any topic. We have a difference on Imam and Khilafah. Open the Quran. What does Allah say regarding Imam and Khilafah? When the word Imam is mentioned, when the word Khalifa is mentioned, what is Allah's attitude? What is His tone? Why is it so difficult for us to come to a conclusion? Is beyond me. A few verses I've selected, inshallah, and I'll continue with Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We see several verses. For example, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 33. إِنِّي جَعَلُ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying, attributing to Himself, I am appointing a resurgent on earth. إِنِّي Allah, إِنِّي جَعَلُ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. In Surah Sad, verse 26, يَا دَاوُودْ إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاكَ خَلِيفَةً فِي الْأَرْضِ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِالْحَقِّ. Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks to David alayhi salam. Dawood says, O Dawood, we have appointed you as a Khalifa. Not a council, not by election, not by the hands of people. Allah, we have. Again, in Surah An-Nur, verse 55, لِيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. And Allah Azza wa Jalla will make them inheritors of the earth, will make them the khulafa of the earth, as He has made those before Him. Again, قَالَ إِنِّي جَاعِلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 124. وَجَعَلْنَاهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا, Surah Al-Anbiya. وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ, Surah Al-Qasas. وَجَعَلْنَا مِنْهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا. Continuously we see it is Allah Himself tying Khilafah and Imamah to Himself. This is Allah's treasure. This is Allah's call, not my call or yours. The 5 methods that we presented, it is the opposite side which needs to bring proof for us. Where has Allah said in the Quran? Elect amongst yourselves, appoint amongst yourselves. Militarily take over the Khilafah for yourselves. Where has Allah once in the Quran said, any one of you can represent it? This comes from a lack of understanding of what it means to be the resurgent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What it means to be Khalifatullah ala al-ard. And we see, up until this very day, the problems that we have because the Ummah abandoned the correct resurgent, the correct wasi. To this very day, we have bloodshed, terrorism, oppression, starvation. Because the Ummah has abandoned Ali ibn Abi Talib. Some of you might think, what it means, you think, why would Allah do this to us? Simply because we abandoned one person. It is because we lack the understanding of who this person is and what an Imam actually is. What this Imam's role is, who this Imam is, who he represents, where his knowledge stems from, what his role on this dunya is, what my relationship between me and him should be, what his right over me is. It is not simply because we abandon the character of Ali ibn Abi Talib. It is not because he is the cousin of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or because he is his son-in-law, or the husband of Fatimiyah alayhi salam. All of these would have been enough in themselves to give him merit over all of mankind. But this is not the reason. Later on we'll see what the Imams alayhi salam say regarding themselves. What is the need for an Imam? One of the vital needs is to safeguard the religion from innovation. Because we saw with the nations that passed, we saw with Bani Israel and those before Bani Israel and those after Bani Israel, we saw through them, when they abandoned their awsiya, the innovations that came into their religion. We saw that Tawheed in itself was affected. We saw that monotheism was diluted, and in other cases destroyed. When a monotheistic faith of a monotheistic prophet like Ibrahim alayhi salam becomes a faith of polytheism and shirk, where Uzair alayhi salam is taken as the son of Allah. And wallahi, this is simply because they abandoned their wasi. Would a Khalifa of Allah ever make such a mistake? Would he ever make such an innovation and draw you to the worship of other than Allah Azza wa Jal? With Isa alayhi salam, when they abandoned the Hawariyin and they took Paul instead of the correct wasi, they ended up with the Trinity. And the Trinity is a mess that even with all due respect to all my Christian brothers and sisters, a mess that even they cannot explain up until today. Khilafah and Imamah, when we tie it to Allah Azza wa Jal, solves this issue of innovation. It solves the issue of leadership. The bloodshed that was spilled in Islam because of Imam. This must be a sacred issue. For the ribs of Fatimah alayhi salam to be broken for this issue must be sacred. For Fatimah alayhi salam to put herself on the line, risk her life, risk her unborn child Muhsin, for this issue, this is a sacred issue. Up until today, because of this abandonment of Imam, other Muslims have problems in Tawheed itself, whether they know it or not. Some Muslim sects came and gave Allah Azza wa Jal a human figure. Some limited him to the space of the throne. Some limited the knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal. Some limited the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of them even came and said there is no such thing as justice when we speak of Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah can be oppressive. Because we abandoned our wasi, we reached a point where there are large sects in Islam that accuse Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam of the most disgusting of behaviors. Forgetfulness, lewdness, foul language, forgetting prayers, and other disgusting acts. And these come simply from abandoning the Imam. We need an Imam to explain and interpret the Quran and Sunnah. We cannot make, and it is unacceptable for us to make the same mistake as Bani Israel did. And leave the interpretation of the Torah to the Pharisees, their scholars. Because each and every single one of these Pharisees has their own interpretation, and each and every one of them added and innovated. But we come to Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, the Imams alayhi salam say, نَحْنُ خُزَّانَ عِلْمِ. We are the storers of the knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal. Because the knowledge is kept pure from Allah to Rasulullah, to the Imams alayhi salam, it is kept absolutely pure. No room for innovation. So the words of Allah Azza wa Jal are given justice. The Quran is given justice. When Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi says, and I challenge any non-Shi'i to discuss the validity of this narration, إني تارك فيكم الثقلين كتاب الله وعترة أهل بيته. I leave with you two weighty things, the book of Allah and my household. Rasulullah emphasizes here that these two things do not abandon one another. They never leave one another. They need one another. You cannot have Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam without Quran. You cannot have Quran without Ahlul Bayt. One completes the other. You read Quran without Ahlul Bayt, we'll see in the narrations that follow, it is as if you have done nothing. Min ayna laka hada, this interpretation that you put forth, where did you get this from? Who did you hear it from? Is it of your own opinion? The words of Allah, the most sacred? You play and you interpret and you give fatwa, verdict regarding these verses as you please. Crimes against Allah Azza wa Jal committed because Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam was abandoned. Crimes against us as believers should be up in arms. We should be extremely angry that our path to salvation was altered, that our way to Allah Azza wa Jal was diverted, that evil took the place of truth, that falsehood prevailed 1400 years ago, and until today we suffer. On all levels we suffer. On a social level we suffer. On a religious level we suffer. On a spiritual level we suffer. Politically we suffer because of these decisions made. One of my teachers, may Allah prolong his life, he says, Wallahi, Wallahi, he says, by Allah, Jerusalem was occupied by the Zionists the day the Khilafah was taken from Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. On this day we lost Jerusalem. On this day Islam lost its honor. And on this day the opposition to evil began from within the house of Fatimiyah alayhi salam. Fatima salamullahi alayha, with everything in her power, her tears were not measly tears of a mother for her father, of her daughter for her father. This is beneath Fatima alayhi salam. Salamullahi alayha, she weeps for you and I. Because Fatima alayhi salam is aware of the truth of Iman, what an Iman is. She is aware that when Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam compares the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam to Safinat Nuh, to the Ark of Noah, and he says, all that bought this Ark are salvaged. You tie yourself to Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, you're saved. وَمَنْ تَخَلَّفَ عَنْهَا غَرَقَ. And those who abandon the Ahlul Bayt drown. Why do you drown? Is there a tribal issue? It's not a tribal issue. It's because your path to Allah Azza wa Jal is now diverted. You have taken an incorrect path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Believers in Tawheed, believers in monotheism, in one Allah, we do not have this false concept of plurality in Islam. We find that plurality contradicts Tawheed. We do not have several paths to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't make sense. When we look at historical battles, for example, in Islam, we take, for example, the battle of the Camel, without going into too much detail out of sensitivity. But we come to our brothers and they say to us, صراع بين حق وحق. al-Mu'mineen and Amir al-Mu'mineen fought one another. If this makes sense to you, do not salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Does it make sense to you that al-Mu'mineen can fight? And salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. You're looking at me for. So they say it is a clash between truth and truth. Two truths and one Allah. And this Allah has two truths, and these two truths are fighting one another. And thousands of companions and believers are being killed because of two truths, and this God is sitting there and He's watching. Is this a merciful God? Is this a just God? Is this an all-knowing, all-wise God? We cannot accept such a God. Our Imams alayhi salam emphasize the importance of Willah in all of our actions. We have a narration, Imam Rida alayhi salam, he comes to go on a journey, and one of his companions, he comes and he says to him, Rasulullah, he says, you come to leave us without giving us a word of advice. Give us a word of advice that we can hold with us and benefit from. So Rida alayhi salam, and this is a famous hadith, and it's called the hadith of the golden chain, because Imam Rida alayhi salam narrates from his father, Imam Qadir alayhi salam, who narrates from his father, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam to Al-Baqir alayhi salam, all the way through to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, who narrates from Jibreel alayhi salam, who narrates from Allah Azza wa Jalla. So there's no fallible person in this chain of narration. Imam Rida alayhi salam says, عن آبائه عن الله عز وجل لا إله إلا الله. That Allah Azza wa Jalla says, La ilaha illallah. The word La ilaha illallah is my fortress. فَمَنْ دَخَلَ حُسْنِي أَمَنَ مِنْ عَذَابِي. And the one who enters my fortress, who enters the realm of La ilaha illallah, the belief of La ilaha illallah, he is now saved from my punishment. Imam Rida alayhi salam, he gives a condition. ثُمَّ قَالَ بِشُرُوطِهِ. La ilaha illallah is a condition. And its condition, he says, وَأَنَا مَنْ. And I am amongst these conditions. Meaning the Imam of Imam Rida alayhi salam is a condition for La ilaha illallah. Meaning your belief is not complete in the oneness of Allah Azza wa Jalla until you believe in the Imam of Muhammad wa ala Muhammad and the Wilayah of Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. All of our narrations, as I said, I'm not here to give a sectarian talk on different sects here. I'm here to give us, the followers of Ahlul Bayt, what our aqeedah is in Imam, how important it is to us. It is not merely an A versus B thing. It is deeply embedded in the knowing of Allah Azza wa Jalla. عن الباقر عليه السلام. He says, Imam Bakr alayhi salam says, بِنَا عُبِدَ اللَّهِ وَبِنَا عُرِفَ اللَّهِ وَبِنَا وَعَدَ اللَّهِ وَمُحَمَّدْ صلى الله عليه وآله حجاب الله. Imam Bakr alayhi salam, he says, through us the Ahlul Bayt, Allah is worshipped. Through us the Ahlul Bayt, Allah is known. Through us the Ahlul Bayt, Allah has given His promise, and Allah has made Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi His veil. Yani to get to Allah Azza wa Jalla, you need to come through these doors. There is no other door. Another narration by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He says, Al-Awsiya, salamullah alayhi, says, Al-Awsiya hum abwabullah Azza wa Jalla allati yu'ta minha. The Awsiya, the surgeons of the prophets, are the doors to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are the doors to Allah Azza wa Jalla, with which we come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through. We cannot know Allah Azza wa Jalla or come to Him unless it is through the Imams. The same way Iblis could not come to Allah Azza wa Jalla until he bowed to Adam alayhi salam. The very same way Allah intended for Himself to be known through Adam and no other way. وَلَوْلَاهُمْ مَا عُرِفَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. And if it wasn't for the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be known. And we know this through history. Had it not been for Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And inshallah, anybody that wishes, I'm more than happy to give him the ahadith, to give him the sources to this. We know that immediately after the demise of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and even in the short period before him, there was a plot to eliminate this Islam, this religion that we have today. It is a historical fact that for over 100 years, after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hadith of Rasulullah was burned. You are not allowed to narrate a hadith. It was punishable by imprisonment, by exile, by death. It wasn't until Umar bin Abdul Aziz, one of the Umayyad Khalifs, that this ban was lifted. And a hadith became known amongst people. The companions of Imam Ali alayhi salam were the only ones that safeguarded these ahadith. So this is at the very least on the surface. When Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, were it not been for us, the Ahlul Bayt, Allah would not even be known. Our journey now towards Imam. We're now coming to the end of this, but we don't want to leave here with just mere facts, correct? We have a duty now towards this responsibility. We have a duty towards Sayyidah Zahra salamullahi alayha, who stood in the face of oppression to preserve the message of her father sallallahu alayhi wa. Believe me, in all sincerity I tell you, and in all honesty and without a doubt, the day the thugs gathered at the door of Fatima alayhi salam, Fatima did not have the well-being of her children. Fatima had our well-being. You and me. The same way Abu Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam protected the water skin on the day of Ashura, Fatima alayhi salam on this day stands in the face of evil to protect the water of life, the water of salvation, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, because she knows that if evil was to befall Ali alayhi salam, then the salvation of you and I would be jeopardized. And we know this is the sunnah of Fatima salam. Because her children narrate to us that when she used to stand in her mihrab every night, she would never pray for herself. She would pray for her neighbors and for the believers and for the mujahideen, and then she would pray for her family members and not mention herself. So for her, salamullahi alayha, to stand that day on the door and take a stance in the face of oppression, a pregnant woman. Those of you who know pregnant women, some of them are scared to walk upstairs. It's very hard for them to walk upstairs, to carry out normal chores. For a young pregnant woman to carry the stress and distress of a gang of foreign men on her door, with evil and violence in their eyes, with fire in their hands, with hatred in their voice, threatening to burn the house of Fatima alayhi salam. Can you imagine the distress and hardships that this young pregnant woman would go through? And she does not go through this, as we said, to protect her husband. Otherwise this would be something very uncommon amongst the Arabs, for a woman to defend the honor of her husband. It should be the other way around. But Fatima sallallahu alayha, he is operating as a waliya, as a shi'i, defending her imam. Because, as we said, she knows the reality of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, and what harm to Ali ibn Abi Talib sallallahu alayhi can do to the rest of the ummah. She knows that the completion of religion is in your allegiance to your imam. As Imam Rida alayhi salam says, Kamal al-Din wilayatun wal bara'ah. The perfection of religion is our wilayah, the wilayah of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And to abstain and to stand in the face and to disassociate yourself from the enemies of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And this is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum of our responsibility today. Through our wilayah today, in our local environment, in our global environment, our political environment, we need to identify who the awliya of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, who the friends of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad are, and who the enemies of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad are. We need to be able to differentiate that the one who risks his life to defend our land, the one who risks his his life to defend our honor, our women, our children, our aqidah, our holy sites, he's definitely in the camp of Muhammad. And that the one dropping bombs on the children of Yemen and on the children of Gaza and shooting at the children of Bahrain is definitely not a friend of Muhammad. So our duty towards Fatimah alayhi salam is to stand in the camp of truth against falsehood. To uphold the religion, at the very least uphold the religion that she, salamullahi alayha, gave her life for. I claim to be a lover of Fatimah alayhi salam, who sacrificed her muhsin for this faith, but I'm not willing to wake up for my morning prayers. I'm not willing to improve my hijab. I'm not willing, as an able male, to go for jihad. I'm not willing to pay khums, but I'll pay lip service to Fatimah. And because we are in also the occasion of the demise of al-Baneen, who is the epitome of tashayyuh. al-Baneen alayhi salam is the finest example of Abu Bakr. Salamullahi alayha, she gives 4 children on the day of Ashura. 4, not 1. 4 children on the day of Ashura. And when Bishop comes and informs her, Allahu ajruki bi, he even reaches Allah ajruki bi qamar al-ashira, Abul Fadl al-Abbas. She says to him, I asked you of Hussein to speak to me of Abbas. I didn't ask you about my children. I asked you about my Imam. Is my Imam safe? Is this a school that we belong to? Can I look myself in the mirror every single day and say, this is a school that I belong to, this is a school that I adhere to? How many of us are willing to give up what al-Baneen alayhi salam has given up? How many of us are willing to take stances like Fatimah alayhi salam? How many of us can stand on the day of resurrection? The day which Fatimah, salamullahi alayha, is asked by Allah Azza wa Jal, Ya Fatimah, look at the people. If we could all just try and envision this scene. The world has been. The dead are risen from their graves. Hell is in front of us, and so is heaven. We can hear the wailing of hell, we can hear the fire burning in hell, and we can see and sense and smell the beauty of Allah Azza wa Jalla in heaven. And all of creation, past and present, are now in one place, and everybody is afraid. No one knows what to do. The Holy Quran, the day you run from your mother and your father and your brother and everybody. Everybody abandons you. In our narration we have, Salamullahi alayha Fatimah al-Zahra alayhi salam, she's given the honor. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says to Fatimah, He says, look at the khalq, look at all of the creation. Look in their hearts and find the one who had love for you. And bring him to heaven. So Fatimah alayhi salam, she looks and she sees, and the hadith says that she picks her Shia the same way birds pick seeds. Then Allah Azza wa Jalla tells her, take another look. Look for the ones who had love for those who loved you. And take them with you to heaven. When you look in the mirror tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, am I worthy of such a salvation? Have I done Fatimah alayhi salam any justice? Were the ribs of Fatimah alayhi salam worthy enough to be broken for me? Am I somebody who deserves the death of Muhsin? Am I somebody who deserves the deep into our souls and see if we are worthy of the dust of the feet of Fatimah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us amongst the Shia of Fatimah and the father of Fatimah and the husband of Fatimah and the children of Fatimah and Yusuf al-Zahra, Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah al-Sharif, who avenge the oppression of Fatimah alayhi salam. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen wa sallallahu